What is the mandate of heaven? It is an idea born 4 millennia ago that holds the key to understanding the world's oldest continuous civilization. It is the story of a nation that rises, falls, and rises again, bound by a relentless, repeating pattern, the dynastic cycle. This idea states that heaven grants a ruler the right to rule, but this right is not permanent. When a dynasty becomes corrupt, when famine and floods plague the land, it is a sign that the ruler has lost the mandate of heaven. Heaven has withdrawn its favor, and it is the right of the people to rebel and install a new dynasty. This is not just a history of emperors and wars. It is the 4,000-year story of how this single idea shaped China. From the mythical sages of the Yellow River to the skyscrapers of Shanghai, this is the story of the mandate of heaven. This is a complete history of China. Our story begins not with stone, but with water, the Yellow River. It was a cradle of life, nourishing the first Chinese civilizations with its rich yellow silt, or los. But it was also a weapon, known as China's sorrow, capable of catastrophic floods that could wipe out entire generations. Chinese myth tells of a great flood that ravaged the land for decades. The tribes were helpless. They turned to a man named Gun, who built massive dikes to block the water. He failed. The floods grew worse. His son Yu tried a different approach. Instead of blocking the water, he dredged canals to guide it to the sea. For 13 years he toiled, his hands and feet covered in calluses. He passed his own home 3 times and did not enter, so focused was he on his task. Finally, the floods subsided. For his service, Yu was hailed as a sage king. He became Yu the Great, and his son is said to have founded China's first dynasty, the Xia. Did the Xia dynasty truly exist? For centuries, it was considered pure myth. But in 1959, archaeologists unearthed a large Bronze Age city at Erlitou. They found palaces, bronze workshops, and artifacts that suggested a complex state, right where and when the Xia were said to have ruled. The myth had found its anchor in history. The first dynasty we can verify, however, is the Shang, rising around 1600 BC. And we know they existed because they left us their words, etched not on paper, but on bone. They were called oracle bones. A Shang king, anxious about the future, would ask a question. Will the harvest be good? Will we win the coming battle? Is the queen's illness fatal? A diviner would carve this question onto a turtle shell or an ox's shoulder blade. He would then apply intense heat, causing the bone to crack. The shape of that crack was the answer from the divine spirits. The question and sometimes the outcome were then inscribed on the bone itself. This was not just fortune-telling. It was the birth of the Chinese written language, a system that has evolved but never broken, surviving to this day. The Shang were masters of bronze, creating impossibly intricate ritual vessels that speak of a society obsessed with ancestors, spirits, and sacrifice. They were a powerful, warlike state, but they could not last. The last Shang king was said to be a depraved tyrant who built a lake of wine and a forest of meat for his orgies. He had lost the mandate. A new power was rising from the west, the Zhao. In 1046 BC, at the Battle of Muye, the Zhao army, far smaller than the Shang's, crushed the corrupt king. The Zhao had claimed the mandate of heaven. It was the Zhou who formalized this concept. They needed to. As usurpers, they had to justify their rule. They declared that heaven itself had transferred the mandate from the wicked Shang to the virtuous Zhou. And with this, they locked in the dynastic cycle that would define China forever. The Zhou dynasty would become China's longest, ruling for nearly 800 years. But it was not 800 years of peace. The first half, the Western Zhou, was stable. But in 771 BC, nomadic invaders sacked the capital. The Zhou court fled east, establishing the Eastern Zhou. Their power was shattered. The king was a mere figurehead. This triggered 500 years of chaos, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. China splintered into hundreds, then dozens of warring kingdoms. It was a time of brutal violence, of shifting alliances, of constant fear. The old order was dead. And yet, from this bloody soil grew China's greatest intellectual blossom. This was the 100 Schools of Thought, an explosion of philosophy where brilliant minds wandered from court to court, all asking one question: how do we fix this broken world? 3 great answers emerged. First, Confucius. He was a wandering teacher who saw a world that had lost its virtue. His solution? Look to the past. He argued for a society built on order, morality, and hierarchy. The son must obey the father, the wife the husband, the subject the ruler, and the ruler must be a virtuous, benevolent father to his people. This was Confucianism, a practical, ethical blueprint for restoring society. Second, Lao Tzu, the old master. He looked at the chaos and laughed. His solution? Stop trying. Society, rules, and ambition were the problem. The answer was to forget it all and look to nature. Follow the Tao, or the way, the effortless, natural flow of the cosmos. This was Taoism, a mystical, anti-establishment philosophy of harmony. And then there was a third, darker answer. Its proponents like Han Feizi saw the chaos and declared, humans are not good. They are selfish, greedy, and stupid. Confucius's virtue was a naive dream. The only solution was power, absolute centralized control. The state must be strengthened with strict, predictable laws and harsh, inescapable punishments. Trust no one. Reward and punish with mechanical precision. This was legalism. A world in chaos now had 3 competing prescriptions: morality, nature, or force. The question was, which one would win? The state of Qin, a grim military powerhouse on the western frontier, adopted legalism as its state religion. For a century, it honed itself into a merciless war machine. Its soldiers were rewarded not for their nobility, but for the number of enemy heads they collected in battle. In 247 BC, a new king ascended the Qin throne. His name was Ying Sheng. He was 13 years old. By the time he was 38, he had done the impossible. He had conquered all his rivals: Han, Shao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi. He had unified China. In 221 BC, Ying Sheng gave himself a new title, one never used before. He was no longer a mere king. He was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Qin Shi Huang's rule was a 15-year storm of legalist transformation. He abolished the old feudal system, dividing the empire into 36 commanderies, all controlled by centrally appointed governors. He standardized everything: the currency, weights and measures, even the axle widths of carts to fit the ruts in his new imperial roads. Most importantly, he standardized the written language. A man from the north and a man from the south could not understand each other's speech, but they could read each other's writing. It was a tool of unification that would bind China together for millennia. To protect his new empire from the northern nomads, the Xiongnu, he connected the old defensive walls of his conquered rivals, creating the first iteration of the Great Wall. It was a project of unimaginable human cost, built by hundreds of thousands of soldiers and conscripted laborers. His paranoia was as vast as his empire. He sought immortality, sending fleets to find the mythical Isles of the Immortals. And in his capital of Xinjiang, he began work on his final resting place, a vast underground tomb. To guard him in the afterlife, he commissioned an entire army of over 8,000 unique life-size terracotta soldiers, a silent clay legion for eternity. But the first emperor tolerated no dissent. His legalist chancellor, Li Si, declared that the 100 schools of thought were over. The only thought allowed was that of the state. He ordered the infamous burning of the books and burying of the scholars, destroying countless philosophical texts. Qin Shi Huang had unified China, but he had done it with fire and blood. His legalist solution was too brutal. Just 3 years after his death in 210 BC, the empire he built to last 10,000 generations exploded in rebellion. The mandate of heaven, so swiftly claimed, was just as swiftly lost. Hello. We're excited to show you our native speech capabilities. Out of the chaos, an unlikely hero emerged, Liu Bang. He was not a noble, a philosopher, or a great general. He was a commoner, a peasant, a minor local official known for his charm and his love of drinking. But he was a brilliant judge of character, and he gathered a loyal band of followers. After years of brutal civil war against the aristocratic general Xiongnu, Liu Bang prevailed. In 202 BC, he declared himself the first emperor of a new dynasty, the Han. The Han dynasty would rule for 400 years, and its genius was synthesis. It kept the centralized state, the commanderies, and the unified standards of the Qing, but it replaced the brutal philosophy of legalism with the humane philosophy of Confucianism. The Han dynasty realized that an empire is not just conquered with force, it must be governed with morality. Under emperors like Han Wudi, the martial emperor, the empire expanded to its greatest extent yet, pushing into Central Asia. This expansion secured the most important trade route in human history, the Silk Road. For the first time, Chinese silk, lacquerware, and technology flowed west, while Central Asian horses, Indian philosophies, and Roman gold flowed east. The world was connected. To run this vast empire, Wudi established Confucianism as the state orthodoxy. He created the Imperial University, where scholars would study the Confucian classics. To get a job in the government, you had to pass an examination based on these texts. This was the birth of the scholar official class, a meritocratic, in theory, bureaucracy that would govern China until the 20th century. The Han was an age of invention. Scribes perfected the process of papermaking. Sima Qian, the grand historian, castrated by Emperor Wudi in a fit of rage, chose to live on in shame to complete his monumental work, the Shiji, or the Records of the Grand Historian, establishing the template for all Chinese historical writing. But the cycle must turn. After 400 years, the Han was rotting from within. Weak emperors were controlled by palace eunuchs and powerful court factions. Landowners grew powerful, oppressing the peasants. In 184 AD, the breaking point came. A Taoist faith healer named Zhang Jue proclaimed that the blue heaven of the Han was dead and the yellow heaven of a new age was coming. His followers, wearing yellow scarves, rose up in the Yellow Turban Rebellion. The rebellion was crushed, but it broke the Han's power. The empire was left in the hands of the very generals who had suppressed the revolt. They saw the weak child emperor in the capital, and they saw their chance. The empire shattered. This began the Three Kingdoms period, one of the most famous, bloody, and romanticized eras in Chinese history. It was an age of epic battles and brilliant strategists, immortalized in the 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Three great factions emerged. In the north, the brilliant and ruthless general Cao Cao held the mandate by controlling the last Han emperor, a puppet in his hands. And the southwest, the virtuous idealist Liu Bei, who claimed to be a distant relative of the Han royal family, sought to restore the dynasty. And in the south, the Sun Clan, led by Sun Quan, defended their lands along the Yangtze River. It was an age of legendary figures: the peerless warrior Guan Yu, the cunning strategist Zhuge Liang, who could read the stars, the bloody Battle of Red Cliffs, where a smaller southern fleet destroyed Cao Cao's massive armada using fire ships. For years, China bled. The Three Kingdoms vied for supremacy, but none could win. The Han dynasty was well and truly dead. China was entering a new dark age. The Three Kingdoms period ended not with a grand victory, but with a quiet usurpation. A powerful family, the Sima, betrayed Cao Cao's successors and briefly reunified China under the Qin dynasty in 280 AD. But the reunification was a mirage. Just decades later, nomadic tribes from the north, the Five Barbarians, swept down, sacking the capital. China shattered again. This began the 16 Kingdoms and the Southern and Northern dynasties, a period of division that would last for almost 300 years. Yet this dark age was a time of profound change. In the chaos and suffering, Confucianism, with its focus on worldly order, seemed to have failed. Many turned to a new faith that had arrived via the Silk Road: Buddhism. Buddhism offered what Confucianism could not: a personal path to salvation, an escape from the suffering of this world. Monasteries and temples spread. Majestic artworks like the Longmen grottos were carved, with thousands of Buddha statues etched into limestone cliffs. Buddhism alongside Taoism became a permanent part of the Chinese spiritual landscape, a powerful counterbalance to the political orthodoxy of Confucianism. Just as the Qin dynasty had forged unity from the warring states, a new dynasty rose to end this division. In 589, the Sui dynasty reunified China. Like the Qin, the Sui was short, brutal, and essential. Its greatest achievement was the Grand Canal. This was and is the longest man-made waterway in the world. A massive 1,000-mile-long canal linking the Yellow River in the north with the Yangtze River in the south. It was an economic lifeline, allowing grain from the fertile south to be shipped to the political and military centers of the north. But like the Great Wall, it was built on the backs of millions of suffering laborers. This, combined with disastrous wars in Korea, exhausted the people. The Sui lost the mandate. In 518, a general named Li Yuan seized power. His son, Li Shimin, would become the true architect of the new dynasty. He murdered his brothers to secure the throne, but then ruled as one of China's greatest emperors, Tang Taizong. This was the Tang dynasty. If the Han was China's classical golden age, the Tang was its cosmopolitan, imperial golden age. The Tang dynasty, ruling for 300 years, was confident, open, and international. Its capital, Chang'an, was the largest, most magnificent city on earth, home to over 1 million people. Arabs, Persians, Indians, and Japanese walked its gridded streets. This was the peak of the Silk Road. New religions like Christianity and Zoroastrianism found a place in the capital. It was an age of culture. Poetry flourished, perfected by its two greatest masters, Li Bai, the poet immortal, a romantic Taoist who wrote of moons and wine, and Du Fu, the poet sage, a Confucian moralist who wrote of the suffering of the common people. The era also produced China's only female emperor, Wu Zetian. Originally a concubine of Tang Taizong, she rose through ruthless court intrigue, allegedly murdering her own infant daughter to frame a rival, to become the wife of the next emperor and then the ruler in her own right. She declared her own dynasty, the Zhou, and ruled as emperor, not empress. Though demonized by later Confucian historians, she was a capable and decisive ruler, a master of politics who elevated Buddhism and expanded the examination system. The Tang dynasty felt invincible. It was the Middle Kingdom, the undisputed center of the world. And then, it all broke. The breaking point was the An Lushan Rebellion in 755 AD. Emperor Exongzong, in his later years, had fallen in love with a beautiful concubine, Yang Guifi. He neglected his duties, placing power in the hands of her corrupt relatives. He also placed immense trust in An Lushan, a charismatic general of non-Chinese descent who controlled the emperor's powerful northeastern armies. An Lushan, seeing the weakness at the center, rebelled. His army swept south, capturing the secondary capital of Luoyang and then the main capital, Chang'an itself. The emperor fled in panic. On the road, his own guards, blaming Yang Guifi and her family for the disaster, mutinied. They forced the emperor to watch as his beloved consort was strangled to death. The rebellion raged for 8 years. It was a catastrophe from which the Tang would never recover. Though the dynasty was restored, the central government's power was broken. Over 10 million people may have died. The Golden Age was over. The cosmopolitan, confident spirit of the early Tang was replaced by a growing suspicion of foreigners. The mandate was bleeding out, and the dynasty limped on for another 150 years before finally collapsing in 907 AD. We are now halfway through 4,000 years of history. We've seen China's birth, its first golden ages, and its shattering collapses. But the story is far from over. Ahead of us lie the technological wonders of the Song, the world-changing conquests of the Mongols, and the final imperial dynasties that would clash with the modern world. If you are enjoying this deep dive into history, please take a moment to subscribe and click the bell icon. It helps our channel continue to create detailed documentaries just like this one. China splintered again. The 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period was a 50-year whirlwind of chaos. In the north, dynasties rose and fell with blinding speed. often led by generals of non-Chinese origin. In 960, a general named Zhao Guangyin was persuaded by his troops to take the throne. He established the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty presents one of history's great paradoxes. Militarily, it was perhaps China's weakest major dynasty. It was born surrounded. To the north, the Khitan Liao dynasty and later the Jurchen Jin dynasty were powerful, aggressive states. The Song was never able to reclaim the northern heartland and was forced to pay massive tributes of silk and silver to its neighbors just to keep the peace. And yet, culturally and economically, the Song was arguably China's most advanced. Lacking military dominance, the Song turned to trade and technology. This was China's great commercial revolution. For the first time, a government's main revenue came from trade, not land taxes. Its cities, like Kaifeng, were bustling centers of commerce, not just administrative hubs. They had restaurants, theaters, and social clubs. This economic boom was fueled by staggering technological innovation. The Song mastered the art of printing with movable type centuries before Gutenberg. This led to an explosion of literacy, cheaper books, and a more educated public. They perfected the magnetic compass, which allowed their massive merchant ships, or junks, to dominate the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, reaching as far as Africa. And they weaponized gunpowder. They had already used it for fireworks, but the Song, desperate for a military edge, created the first firearms, fire lances, primitive cannons, and explosive bombs. In this wealthy urban society, they even invented the world's first government-issued paper money. This was a society on the verge of a scientific and industrial revolution. But it was not to be. In 1127, the Jurchen Jin dynasty did the unthinkable. They invaded from the north, sacked the capital, and captured the entire Song imperial family. The dynasty fled south, establishing the Southern Song, a wealthy but vulnerable rump state. And then, from the steppes of Mongolia, came the storm. In the early 1200s, a chieftain named Temujin united the warring Mongol tribes. He took the title Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler. He and his sons unleashed the largest land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific to the borders of Europe. China was their greatest prize. Genghis began the conquest. His grandson, Kublai Khan, finished it. After decades of bloody war, one of the last holdouts being the powerful Song navy, Kublai Khan did what no barbarian had ever done before. In 1279, he conquered all of China. He established a new dynasty, the Yuan. This was not a normal conquest. The Mongols did not become Chinese. They were a foreign occupying force. Kublai Khan admired Chinese culture, but he ruled as a Mongol. He set up a rigid, four-tiered social system. At the top were the Mongols. Second were other foreigners, like Persians, Arabs, and even Europeans, whom the Mongols used as administrators. One of those foreigners was a young merchant from Venice, Marco Polo, who served in Kublai Khan's court for 17 years and whose journals would introduce a fascinated Europe to the wonders of Cathay. In this system, at the bottom were the Chinese. Northern Chinese were third class. Southern Chinese, who had resisted the longest, were fourth class. They were banned from holding high office and were treated with deep suspicion. But the Mongol Pax Mongolica secured the Silk Road. Trade flourished. China was open to the world, but it was not its own master. This could not last. The Han Chinese, who made up 90% of the population, saw the Mongols as illegitimate, brutal rulers. The mandate of heaven, they believed, could not be held by foreign oppressors. In the 1350s, a combination of floods on the Yellow River, famine, and plague, the Black Death, was seen as a sign. heaven was furious. A new rebellion, the Red Turban Movement, rose up. One of its leaders was a destitute peasant and former Buddhist monk. In 1368, he captured the capital, Dadu, modern Beijing. The last Mongol emperor fled back to the steppe. The Yuan dynasty, less than a century old, was over. Zhu Yuanzhang declared a new dynasty, the Ming, meaning bright. The Han Chinese were masters of their own land once again. The Ming dynasty began with a burst of restoration and ambition. The first emperor, Hung Wu, was a paranoid and brutal ruler, but he re-established the Confucian examination system and drove out all Mongol influence. His son, Yonglei, moved the capital to the north, to Dadu, and renamed it Beijing. There, he began construction on a magnificent new imperial palace, a city within a city, forbidden to all but the imperial court, the Forbidden City. Yonglei's ambition was not just directed inward. He wanted the world to recognize the glory of the restored Ming. He commissioned a vast treasure fleet, hundreds of massive ships, some the largest wooden vessels ever built, and he put them under the command of his favorite court official, the Muslim eunuch admiral Zhang He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zhang He led 7 epic voyages, not of conquest, but of diplomacy and trade. His fleet sailed to Vietnam, India, the Persian Gulf, and all the way to the eastern coast of Africa, bringing back exotic gifts like giraffes and ostriches to the imperial court. It was a staggering display of China's wealth and technological might. And then in 1433, it just stopped. After the death of Yonglei and Zhang He, the new emperor, swayed by his powerful Confucian scholar officials, ordered the voyages to end. These scholars were deeply suspicious of merchants and foreign contact, believing China was a self-sufficient civilization that needed nothing from the barbarians. The fleet was left to rot. The records of its voyages were destroyed. It is one of the great what-if moments in history. Just decades before European explorers like Columbus and da Gama would begin tentatively sailing the coasts of Africa in tiny caravels, China had retreated from the world. The Ming dynasty turned inward. They focused their energy on rebuilding and completing the Great Wall as we know it today, a massive stone barrier against the northern nomads. For 200 years, the Ming dynasty was stable and prosperous, but the cycle was turning. By the early 1600s, a series of weak emperors, crippling corruption, famine, and rebellion had brought the dynasty to its knees. And from beyond the Great Wall, a new threat had arrived: the Manchu. The Manchu were a nomadic people from Manchuria. In 1644, as a Chinese rebel army sacked Beijing and the last Ming emperor hanged himself, a Ming general made a fateful choice. He opened the gates of the Great Wall and invited the Manchu army in to restore order. The Manchu came in, and they never left. They seized the throne and established China's final dynasty, the Qing, meaning pure. Like the Mongols, they were foreign conquerors. But unlike the Mongols, the Qing were brilliant administrators. They adopted the Confucian system, the examinations, and the bureaucracy. They ordered all Han Chinese men to adopt the Manchu hairstyle, a shaved forehead and a long braid called a queue, as a sign of submission. But they governed as Confucian sages. Under emperors like Qin Shi and Qianlong, the Qing dynasty entered its own golden age. They were masters of a multi-ethnic empire, expanding China to its largest territorial extent ever, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia into the realm. For 150 years, China was powerful, stable, and largely at peace. By 1800, China was the largest economy on Earth, making up an estimated 1/3 of global GDP. It looked down on the rest of the world as distant, inferior barbarians. But a new kind of barbarian was at the gates. They came not on horseback from the steppe, but in steam-powered warships from the sea. And they were from Europe. The 19th century began what China would later call the century of humiliation. The trouble began with Great Britain. British merchants were buying massive quantities of Chinese tea, but China wanted nothing from Britain in return, except silver. This trade imbalance was draining Britain's treasury. So they found a product the Chinese would buy: opium. When the Qing Emperor tried to ban the devastating drug trade, Britain declared war. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, was a disaster for China. Manchu banners and ancient cannons were no match for British rifles and steamships. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of many unequal treaties. It ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened up ports for foreign trade, and paid massive reparations. The defeat was a profound psychological shock. The Middle Kingdom had been humbled. It was a sign. Heaven was angry. The Qing had lost the mandate. In 1850, this belief exploded into the most destructive civil war in human history: the Taiping Rebellion. A failed scholar named Hongxiang Chuan, who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, led a massive rebellion to create a heavenly kingdom of great peace. The rebellion raged for 14 years. The Qing dynasty, with the help of Western-trained armies, eventually crushed it. But the cost was staggering. At least 20 million people died. The Qing dynasty was now hollow. It was beset by foreign powers carving out spheres of influence and torn apart by internal revolts. In 1911, a revolution finally toppled the last emperor, a young boy named Pu Yi. The mandate of heaven, the dynastic cycle that had governed China for over 2,000 years, was officially over. What replaced it was chaos. The new Republic of China, founded by Sun Yat-sen, was a noble idea, but it quickly collapsed and China fell into the warlord era, where rival generals carved up the country into personal fiefdoms. Two new forces emerged to try to unify the broken nation: the nationalists, or the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party, a small band of revolutionaries, one of which was a peasant's son named Mao Zedong. They were locked in a bitter civil war when an even greater threat arrived. In 1937, Imperial Japan launched a full-scale invasion. The war was unspeakably brutal. The rape of Nanking saw Japanese soldiers massacre up to 300,000 civilians. The nationalists and communists formed a fragile truce to fight the common enemy, but the war devastated China. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Civil War resumed almost immediately. And to the world's surprise, Mao's communists, with their deep support among the peasantry and disciplined, battle-hardened troops, won a decisive victory. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists fled to the island of Taiwan. On October 1, 1949, in Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong announced the creation of a new state, the People's Republic of China. A new dynasty? Mao ruled as a new, emperor in all but name. He was a revolutionary, not a sage king. He sought to destroy the old Confucian past. His great leap forward in the 1950s, an attempt to rapidly industrialize the country, led to the worst famine in human history. His cultural revolution in the 1960s unleashed chaos, destroying temples, art, and ancient thought in a bid to purge China of its feudal past. When Mao died in 1976, China was poor, isolated, and traumatized. But then came the great reversal. The new leader, Deng Xiaoping, a practical man who had survived Mao's purges, declared a new path. He said, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Ideology took a backseat to results. Deng opened China to the world, creating special economic zones. It was a staggering success. In 40 years, China unleashed the fastest economic transformation in human history. 800 million people.
We've covered 4,000 years, but which part of China's story do you find the most fascinating? Was it the philosophical boom of the warring states, the technological revolution of the Song, or the dramatic rise of the modern era? Let us know in the comments below. And thank you for watching.